Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible. Financial geniuses. Monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it. So your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
I'm Scott Hansen, host of NFL Red Zone. Lowe's knows Sundays are for football. That's why we're here to help you get your next DIY project done, even when the clock isn't on your side. Whether that's a new Filtrete filter or Bosch and Cobalt power tools, Lowe's has everything you need to feel like the MVP of DIY. So get it done and earn your Sunday. Shop now, in-store and online. Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
Diacetyl is a chemical compound produced during fermentation that's often described as contributing a buttered popcorn or buttery in general characteristic, as well as a slick mouthfeel to beer. While the BJCP contends it's appropriate in small quantities in certain styles, diacetyl is widely viewed as an off flavor that's to be avoided at all costs, and while most brewers rely on mechanical methods for accomplishing this task, that is not the only option. You're listening to the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to chat about the anti-diacetyl enzyme known as alpha-acetolactate decarboxylase, also known more simply as ALDC.
I really hate diacetyl. I think that of all of the off flavors, it is my most despised. And I think I'm pretty sensitive to it as well. So, being a fairly active lager brewer, this is something I chased for years. Diacetyl rest this or fermentation temperature that. And when ALDC came along, it was like a cheat code. And I am absolutely loving having such a sciencey, tool in the toolkit as it comes to diacetyl mitigation.
Yeah, I don't fault you for that. Now, this is yet again another product that I have zero experience with, in part because I've never actually had issues with diacetyl, at least as far as my palate is telling me. And so to me, those problems are what warrant the use of something like ALDC, but I absolutely see its value, and I look forward to chatting with you about it today, Jordan, as well as going over the results of an experiment that you performed on the subject. Now, I think the first thing we have to get out of the way is the fact that we're referring to this compound as diacetyl. We're going to use that word a lot, and if you're shaking your head because you call it diacetyl, we do apologize. I understand that both are accurate, but you're a diacetyl person, Jordan, right?
I am, but I've heard the same thing, that both are allowed, so I'll stick with the first one as I pronounced it.
That's my plan, but I might go back and forth just to fool with some people. So anyways, if you're a diacetyl person, we're talking about the same thing. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor. In fact, our very own Steve Thanos is hosting his brew day right now. I'm looking at it on my other screen. He's got a couple of patrons there, which is just a really cool experience. So learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. And a huge shout out to all of our current patrons for helping to keep us producing this content. We wouldn't be here without you. Finally, if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate that, as it helps those who have yet to hear about us to more easily find the show. Plus, we really do like knowing what you think. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not quite ready to make the jump to electric, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits, among other really neat, unique gear. If you've been considering going electric, though, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Vincent Fabiani left us some feedback on Spotify after listening to our latest Brew and A episode where we talked about the Pinter brewing system. Vincent said, I have a Pinter and first made a Pilsner kit from their store, which was okay. After that, I made a 2-gallon all-grain batch of brown ale on my original system and pitched it into the Pinter following their brewing guide. It came out fantastic. Brewing a wort and pitching into the unit defeats the purpose, or their purpose, he says, but I think it could be a cool way to pilot new recipes. Now, just a quick note, I believe Vincent is saying he made the wort on his standard homebrewing setup, then fermented it and served it from the Pinter, because that's kind of how that system uses. I don't know if you've ever used one of these kind of newfangled brewery systems, but I haven't. What are your thoughts on what Vincent's saying about the Pinter, Jordan?
I think this is the second person that's written in and said something to this extent. And so
I'm telling you, when we brought this up on that episode, I've received more feedback on that than I ever expected. So I'm kind of cherry picking here. What the part of his that's curious to me is that he basically did an all grain batch on this Pinter, which my understanding is designed for like extract, real simple, low volume extract batches.
Sure. Yeah. And so I'm just impressed that there's a legion of users out there that are kind of hacking this thing to, meet their needs and desires. And so I don't have any experience with any Pinters or Pico brews or what have you. I know what they are. And, it kind of sounds like fermenting and serving from the keg, which, a lot of all grain 5-gallon home brewers do. But this is a just kind of convenient device that allows you to do that at a small scale and no kegerator required. You can just do it straight from your, kitchen refrigerator. So, yeah, for small batch brewers, sure. Sounds like a nice little system.
Yeah, so here's my thinking on it. Based on prior feedback that we have received about the Pinter, I was under the impression that it could actually be used on its own to make all grain batches of beer, albeit relatively small volumes of beer. When I looked more into it, I did find that this isn't necessarily the case. In fact, the Pinter even states, they state on their website that the wort has to be mashed and boiled, aka produced, if you will, separately, meaning on different gear. And then you put that wort, which again, if you're going the extract route, you're just making wort by mixing, extract with water. So you put that in the Pinter and then it ferments and you can serve from the Pinter. So really in my mind, I'm kind of back to thinking it's not really for me, just because I would want bigger volumes of beer. Plus, if I'm already producing the wort on its own, I would rather put that wort into my own fermentation keg and throw that in a fridge. I already have the Keyser and just serve it from there. So I think the Pinter is really cool for, as like a gateway for new brewers who want to start off using a really simple extract approach, and then maybe the bug bites and they move on to other things. I don't see how somebody like me who is, or you even, Jordan, to me, it just sounds like a serving mechanism because it's like a refrigerated unit that allows you to serve from it. I don't know. It wouldn't really serve much of a purpose for me, but I do appreciate again the fact that it's an available option for people who want to maybe just dip their toes into the world of brewing at home. And from what I hear, the extract kits actually aren't that bad. I think Will said he got one of these for his neighbor, and the beer turned out surprisingly good. So by all means, go support that business. Get into use it, buy these as gifts for people you think might like homebrewing. I just don't think for established homebrewers like you and me, Jordan, it sounds like much of a beneficial product.
You know what it reminds me of? It kind of seems like the refrigerated draft service equivalent of a Mr. Beer kit.
I think that's the way Will sort of described it, actually.
And so I think that you're right. I would not assume that very many of our listeners are so new to home brewing that they don't have any equipment and that this would really serve their needs. But for a gateway, affordable device to get someone into the hobby, it sounds like a great idea. And I'm glad to hear that it's getting some level of traction.
Yeah, and massive thanks to Vincent for reaching out and sharing this with us. He's actually sounds like an established brewer who is still appreciating the Pinter. So it really is more of a whatever floats your boat. And in this case, it seems that the Pinter might be just a really good solution for some people, but maybe not everyone. So thanks for hitting us up, Vincent. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. We'll be right back.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
This week, on a very special episode of Health Discovered, we're taking a closer look at a condition that affects hundreds of thousands of men each year, prostate cancer.
I first found out about my cancer on my birthday at the age of 45. Found out my cancer has spread to my pelvic bone. And from there, life just changed.
About 1 in 8 men will be diagnosed with prostate cancer during their lifetime, and the risk increases with age.
Anything with cancer, you just think death sentence. And the only thing I could think about was, who's going to take care of my family? You have to go out there and build your support system. You got to build your team.
In this episode, we'll explore the science behind detection, along with the practical steps men can take to protect their health. Listen to Health Discovered on America's #1 podcast network, iHeart. Open your free iHeart app, search Health Discovered, and start listening.
As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Fermentation may not be magic, but it certainly feels magical at times, turning sugary sweet wort into delicious beer. While alcohol and CO2 are the most commonly discussed byproducts of the fermentation process, there are several other compounds produced as well, one being diacetyl, which most brewers actively work to avoid. Jordan, before we shift our focus specifically to ALDC, let's start by discussing some of the generals of fermentation first.
Fermentation is a process that involves yeast consuming sugars extracted from malted grains, and ultimately that produces alcohol, carbon dioxide, and some other key compounds. And, there are certain compounds out there that some may find desirable and others may find them less so. And there's others that are, more associated with a given style or a given yeast strain. And ultimately, it's up to the brewer to dial in their process and their ingredients to, pull these levers in the right direction for a given style or for what they're ultimately aiming to achieve.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, when they hear fermentation, and present company included here, your first thoughts are alcohol and CO2. I mean, that's what we are most focused on when it comes to fermenting, wort into beer. But all of these other things that we talk about, not all of them, but a good chunk of them are also byproducts of the fermentation process. For example, esters, the family of esters, and there are many esters that are focused on in the world of beer, but there are a few we'll talk about. But esters are kind of broadly known for contributing these fruity and floral characteristics to beer in various forms. For example, isoamyl acetate tastes like what, Jordan?
Tastes like banana, and we typically associate that with German Hefeweizen strains.
Exactly. And then when we talk about English beers, we're often talking about their ester quality, which is largely ethyl acetate, which tastes like pear. It's interesting to me that sometimes, I'll be talking to another brewer and they'll taste a beer and they're like, oh man, the tropical fruit, that must have a lot of esters. That's probably more a hop contribution. The esters that we typically associate with fermentation tend to lean more in the ones that are the strongest in beers fermented with, say, common ale yeast and lager yeast are going to be things like ethyl acetate and isoamyl acetate. These are banana and pear flavors. And so, those are one of the byproducts. And then of course, kind of the other thing that's often talked about along with esters are phenols, which are spicy. And what are some of the most common phenols associated with beer?
Well, one of the ones that I think of the most is 4-VG or 4-vinyl glycol, which is classically associated with clove. And again, that's one that you can really find in German Hefeweizen strains. It's also common in a lot of Belgian ale strains. And so, some of these phenols could be very appropriate in a given beer style when you're using a given yeast strain. But if you're trying to make a clean blonde ale using Chico and you're getting, 4VG, something ain't right.
Something ain't right. And just as an aside, all of these that we're talking about under the byproducts of fermentation can be contributed through some sort of a contamination. So that's why we focus so heavily on ensuring that our gear is clean and sanitized. You were commenting on phenols that are inappropriate in certain styles. There are also phenols that are inappropriate in any style, one of which is chlorophenols, which contributes that medicinal kind of gross plasticky flavor. Anybody who has ever drank a beer that was made with highly chlorinated or chlorominated water, or maybe was served out of a green water hose, has likely experienced this medicinal flavor. It's very unpleasant. Another family of compounds that is associated with fermentation is sulfur. The worst one, in my opinion, being hydrogen sulfide, which is we'll call it rotten egg, but I think most people associate it with some other aroma. And it's very common when fermenting lager beers with certain types of lager strains at cooler temperatures.
And here comes Hefeweizen again. I had one last night from a really good local craft brewer, and it was rotten egg blast. I mean, it was just so much hydrogen sulfide. And that's the thing about Hefeweizens is you can pick some of that up too. These yeast strains, they throw a lot of these other compounds around sometimes.
Yeah, I get the same thing in Hefeweizen, particularly fresh Hefeweizen. And one of the reasons for that is that sulfur is surprisingly easy to get rid of. It's one of those off flavors that's not going to actually ruin the beer indefinitely. Those first few pours might be your indicator that you need to do something to get rid of it, but it will volatilize off. You can actually, if you disconnect a keg of beer that, say, has sulfur in it or hydrogen sulfide, you give it a little shake, you let it settle, you purge the keg, you do it again until you're not smelling that farty smell. It'll actually go away, which is that's a nice thing. So, that egg smell people get, I see it online all the time. People are kind of freaking out about, I'm fermenting my first Pilsner and it smells like rotten egg. Don't worry about that. You have nothing to worry about. It will go away or should go away. But there is a much more commonly discussed sulfur compound in beer, and that's dimethyl sulfide or DMS, which to me, I've said this a million times, actually smells like warmed up ketchup that's been sitting on the counter for a while. A lot of people will describe it as cooked corn or creamed corn or like cooked vegetables. What's your experience with DMS?
Yeah, that's one that I don't think I'm very sensitive to. 2015 Homebrew Con in San Diego, where I actually met you for the first time. They did a off flavors class. It was a really cool AHA homebrew. What did they call it back then? NHC, National Homebrew Convention.
Yeah, back
session.
Then.
Yeah, and so they did an off flavor kit for like a room of like hundreds of people, and it was really cool to like go through all of the off flavors. And the DMS one definitely spiked above threshold levels. Didn't really bother me, and so it's pretty rare that I'm complaining about DMS in a beer.
That's unique because I think homebrewers just love pretending like they can detect these things. That's my cynical perspective, and so you often hear people talking about DMS as well as a very common aldehyde and or ketone that we're going to talk about here in a minute. That is another family of compounds, these aldehydes and ketones. You'll often hear people discussing acetaldehyde. It's not acetaldehyde, it's acetaldehyde, which people describe as having like a green apple skin character. To me, it smells more like when you're carving a pumpkin for Halloween and you get that kind of raw squash smell. Some people will also describe it as that wet cut grass aroma. I think it may very well be like the concentration of the acetaldehyde in a beer will present itself differently, but that's a common one. But perhaps the most common of these VDKs, of vicinal diketones, I believe is what it's referred to, is diacetyl, which we're going to focus a bit more on here. And just to go along with what you were saying about your flavor standard experience at NHC, we were sponsored for a minute by a company called Flavor Active, who sent us a bunch of these flavor standards, two of which were diacetyl and dimethyl sulfide, or DMS. Oddly enough, when we did the I think we have episodes on both of these actually. When we did the DMS experiment where I served this to a bunch of blind tasters, I was one of the few who was insanely sensitive to the DMS flavor. And it was wild to me watching these people taste these beers in the triangle test and just go, yo, they taste exactly the same to me. And I'm sitting there going, what are you talking about? Meanwhile, when we did the diacetyl one, I believe I was the only one in one of the settings of data collection who could not pick out the diacetyl dosed beer. So you and I kind of have sounds like we have an opposite experience when it comes to DMS and diacetyl.
Well, it's funny because at the top of the show, you said you haven't really had a problem with diacetyl.
That's what I was going to say, man. Maybe it's that I do, and I just don't taste it. I've absolutely tasted diacetyl in beer. Now, when we do those flavor standard ones, we are pushing it to just above what using the amount of flavor standard to get it just above what the accepted perceptible threshold is. So it could be that at higher concentrations, I would pick it up, and I imagine I would. But when it's just right there hovering around where the science says is the common, perceptible threshold, I just couldn't pick it out.
And, I don't really get a ton of diacetyl in homebrews these days. It kind of, maybe everyone's using ALDC, which we'll talk more about that. Or maybe I've just, I have a biased sample and I'm surrounding myself with really great homebrewers. But, I get it occasionally in a rando brew pub in Anywhere USA, where they try a lager, or you get one, they're like, there's no way that this brewery has diacetyl. This dive bar or sports bar, whatever, has never cleaned their lines.
That's right.
Yeah. And there is nothing worse than a diacetyl bomb in a pint glass in a public establishment. It is just disgusting.
Oh, I'll tell you what. I had this experience. Now, this was probably 15 years ago. We were at I believe it was my sister-in-law's nursing school graduation, and we went to this kind of fancy, restaurant, and they had just Sierra Nevada Green Label on tap. And they bring me this glass of Sierra Nevada, and I'm telling you, it tasted like butterscotch and hops. It was so awful, and it was pretty obvious to me this was not a brewery. It was pretty obvious to me that they just weren't cleaning their lines. So the reason we talk about that is that diacetyl, which we're going to explain a little bit more about what exactly this compound is, it can be contributed to beer through various avenues. It's not just from fermentation. It is also, caused by contamination and other things as well. So it's really important to pay attention to this compound. So what exactly is diacetyl, Jordan? I know disclaimer, we are not chemists by any means, but we've been brewing long enough to at least have some understanding of what these things are.
Right. So diacetyl or diacetyl is an organic compound that's produced as a natural byproduct of fermentation. And people often will say that this imparts a buttery flavor or even a slick mouthfeel to beer. And a fun fact that, some of our listeners might know is they actually used to use diacetyl as the flavoring agent in movie theater popcorn butter. But it turns out that it's really dangerous for the factory workers that were working around it and was giving them cancer. And I don't know if it's like an actual X-ray similarity, or if it's just because of the fact that they're working in popcorn factories, but they actually call the illness popcorn lung. From extreme overexposure to diacetyl. But at the homebrew level, or even like a gross pint at a dive bar, you're not going to get cancer if you have diacetyl in your beer. But this is not something that you want to spend, years in a factory, around every day.
Yeah, if you look up whether or not diacetyl is a carcinogen, it is not. But like you said, this popcorn lung thing is very real. So you're not going to get sick from drinking a beer that has diacetyl in it. That you don't have to worry about anything like that. I will say though, you commented on the slick mouthfeel. That is my number one telltale sign that a beer might have diacetyl in it. And usually, if I move into that retronasal way of drinking beer, which is where you put some beer in your mouth, you swallow it, and then you breathe out of your nose really fast. That's where I'm going to pick up even a hint of diacetyl, which my version, when I say it's a hint, it might be super strong to somebody else. I fully accept that. But the slick mouthfeel is what does it for me. And I'll tell you, I hate that feeling. That is not a pleasant experience to me. I like that crisp, washes off your palate. And so when it's slick, I'm pretty sure there's probably some diacetyl in that beer. Now, how is diacetyl produced? We are not going to go in too deep into this because again, we're not chemists and we don't want to mislead anybody. So just to keep it kind of superficial, during fermentation, while synthesizing the amino acid called valine, yeast produces a precursor compound called alpha acetolactate, some of which leaks out of the yeast cells and into the beer. Now, over time, that alpha acetolactate reacts with any available oxygen in the beer. Put a pin in that, to create diacetyl. So if you really break it down in its simplest form, there's all these amino acids, one of which is valine. When you put yeast into beer, that valine mixes with the yeast and it produces this compound called alpha acetolactate. Alpha acetolactate. That's going to be a word you're going to hear again. Some of which, again, leaks out into the beer, and that causes that when it interacts with oxygen, it creates diacetyl, and you get that buttery flavor in beer. So, oxidation. We talk about it all the time. It is so important for us. I'm just going to get this out there right up front. It's so important for us to keep oxygen exposure to at the bare minimum. If we can mitigate it completely, ideally, that's what we're going to want to do. And so, that beer, another issue with oxygen exposure is that it will react with any of that alpha acetolactate to create diacetyl. So again, just another thing to keep in mind.
Right. And so sometimes when you're making a beer, it tastes great on draft, or it tastes great before you've carved it with your hydrometer sample. And then all of a sudden, you bottle it up for a competition, or you're serving it on draft, or you're serving your bottles, and you're like, what the hell? There's diacetyl in this. Where did it come from? Yeah. And it's because you had some precursors that were converted often during packaging, and especially during secondary packaging, like bottling up some bottles for a competition. So I know we stress the importance of cold side oxygen mitigation so much on this show, and diacetyl is not one that we talk about enough. This is really an important reason to mind your oxygen.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about some of the main causes of diacetyl in beer. I think most people have probably heard about the majority of these. The first one that comes to my mind is just bad, poor yeast health. Healthy yeast, when you pitch healthy yeast into beer, it reabsorbs most diacetyl that is created anyway, such that the concentration is below flavor or taste thresholds. If you're pitching stressed yeast, it's less effective at this cleanup process. So how do you stress yeast out? First off, if you're using really old yeast, so it's got low viability, one way to fix that is by building up a starter or propagating that yeast. So underpitching is one way. Deficient nutrients in your wort can lead to stress on the yeast, which ultimately produces diacetyl in the beer. If you're fermenting a really high OG or a strong beer with too little yeast, you'll see the common thread here is not enough viability in pitching that yeast, can lead to diacetyl. The beers where I've intentionally pitched really low amounts of yeast just to see what would happen, because I'm dumb like that, I'm experimental, you absolutely do get that slick mouthfeel and that buttery flavor if you do that, because at the higher concentrations, now you mix in some other components, it can really be overwhelming.
Right. And so it's not only the amount of yeast you're using, it's the type of yeast you're using. There are certain types of yeast strains that are more prone to diacetyl production. And there's a lot of variables that we're talking about right now that you can help dial that in one way or the other. But notably, there are certain Czech lager strains that are notoriously high producers. There's also some German lager strains that produce more than other German lager strains. And there's some English ale strains even that can produce it. But whereas there's, like a Trappist ale strain from Belgium or something, we might not expect a whole lot of diacetyl production, at the very least at the temperatures at which we're pitching it.
Yeah, exactly. Another common cause. I don't know if cause is the best word, but cooler fermentation temperatures are associated with higher amounts of diacetyl. And this is, again, it all kind of boils down to a similar kernel here. Yeast activity is positively correlated with temperature, right? So the warmer you ferment, the more active that yeast is going to be, which means it's going to be more readily available to reabsorb any diacetyl that is produced. So cooler temperatures can lead to higher concentrations of diacetyl just due to lower activity. So how, do we get rid of this? One of the most common ways is to perform a diacetyl rest, where you're raising the temperature of that cool fermented beer up into, the mid 60s, maybe even the low 70s if you're crazy, which you're looking at around, 20 degrees Celsius, give or take a few. And that, again, what you're doing is you're motivating that yeast, in essence, to reabsorb any diacetyl that was created before reducing the temperature into the lagering phase.
And this is another reason that we like to recommend pitching fairly heavy, or at least I do, when making these cold fermented beers, because that is one additional piece of insurance that you can use. Is there's kind of a correlation between, or a relationship between the amount of yeast that you're adding and the temperature at which you're adding it to, and the resulting amount of diacetyl that's made and taken up.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell a quick story. I had a friend a few years ago who was, he first started off by messaging his group of our local group of homebrewing friends. And he says, "Hey, I got this beer. I'm almost certain it has diacetyl in it. I want you guys to taste it and let me know what's up." And so we all get together, we all taste this beer. Sure enough, it is just riddled with, more than like anybody would taste it. Right. And as we start to kind of troubleshoot, he's looking at me and he's like, "Okay, man," and he's trying to like catch me off guard. Well, come to find out, it was a pilsner. It was a really light pilsner, which you're going to taste any flaws in that over you are, more than you are a beer that has a bunch of hops in it or is really malty or anything like that. Basically, what he explained was that he rushed this beer to the keg and then was serving it like 4 or 5 days after he had kegged it. And so, and I say this because one of the common causes of diacetyl in beer is just insufficient conditioning time. You haven't given that beer enough time for any, yeast that's left, even in the package, to reabsorb that diacetyl. And one of the arguments that I've heard for why early German brewers were employing these, extended lagering times was to give that beer enough time for whatever yeast is left over to reabsorb any off flavors, but one of those being diacetyl.
And I think that's particularly important if you're not doing a diacetyl rest or employing some sort of chemical additive like ALDC. Traditional German brewers in Germany, or some stateside like Bierstadt, they don't do a diacetyl rest. They pitch cold and they let it ferment the entire time cold. And that conditioning time and they'll often ramp down slowly to get to lager temperatures, so we're not crashing out the yeast too quickly and giving it this low and slow approach to diacetyl reduction. And so, whereas if you're doing a diacetyl rest, it should taste pretty darn good as soon as the beer is cold, and you don't need that extended lagering necessarily, at least when it comes to diacetyl reduction.
Yeah, I was talking to a buddy, a fan of Brülosophy actually, who lives I believe it's in Frankfurt, Germany, and he was an assistant brewer at a well-known, lager brewery out there. And he was saying they perform diacetyl rests regularly. I mean, that is not a bad thing to do, to raise the temperature of your beer, 15 degrees Fahrenheit towards the end of fermentation to drive off any of those fermentation byproducts. We already mentioned contamination as being a source of diacetyl. Contamination not just meaning infected beer, but it could be like a dirty beer line. You're just contaminating the beer and it produces this nasty buttery character. That's always something to keep in mind as well. But, when we think about ways to get, avoid getting diacetyl in our beers, a lot of those are mechanical, like we just talked about. Extended lagering time, make sure you're doing a diacetyl rest. But there is this chemical approach as well, and that is known as alpha acetolactate. We talked about that earlier. That is the what ends up interacting with oxygen to create diacetyl. So alpha acetolactate decarboxylase. I'm not entirely sure what decarboxylation is, But my understanding is that what it does is when you add this ALDC, again, alpha acetolactate decarboxylase, to beer, it does something to that alpha acetolactate such that when it interacts with oxygen, it creates ALDC is an enzyme. All right. There's enzymes everywhere in beer. This is another one that you can add to beer that prevents the formation of that diacetyl, again, by interrupting that precursor and converting it to a flavorless compound called acetoin, I believe is what it's called.
That's just what I understand, right? And I'm telling you, this is a cheat code. You just add a dropper or two at yeast pitch, and you'll never see diacetyl again, at least not, once you're actually packaging and tasting this thing. And there's so many pros you can't deny. It reduces that maturation time, like we just talked about. You might not need to lager it as long. For hoppy beers, it can prevent the diacetyl production that's associated with hop creep. So you're not getting a gross buttery flavor in your Sierra Nevada Pale Ale clone. And also it can really improve your consistency, which is important for the professionals, of course. But we don't want diacetyl bombs at home. And, another thing is that for diacetyl prone strains, like certain Czech lager strains, for example, maybe you don't want butter in your homemade Czech lager.
Yes.
That's okay. You don't have to have it, even though you might find some over there in Prague. And so we can actually alter the chemistry, basically, of a yeast strain that we're using and make diacetyl-free Czech beers, for example. So a lot of pros in my book.
Yeah, and I scoured the internet for at least 4 minutes looking for people complaining about ALDC or sharing some of what we might call cons or drawbacks to using this stuff. There really aren't many. The biggest one is that you have to pay for it, but it's so cheap, so not really a con in my book. I think it's like, $5 for a bottle that'll get you through several batches of beer, something like that.
No, it's like 30.
Real 30? I'm talking $30 just for one batch? There's no way.
No, it's $30 for like the little vial that lasts like 10 batches or so.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. So really not that expensive. The other thing that I read is that it is sensitive to pH, meaning that it's just less effective in beers with a lower pH. It's from what I read, it has to be down into what we might refer to as like sour beer range for pH. And so I'm not sure that's a big diacetyl is a huge issue in those because of the other processes that are being used, but it doesn't say it's ineffective. I just read that it could be less effective. Other than that, I cannot think of any other cons to using ALDC besides cost and its pH sensitivity.
Yeah, I've heard the pH sensitivity myself, and I will say that a con is it's somewhat inconsistent. Like 1 out of 99 times, you might still get a little bit of D. I have had that happen where I was like, what the heck? I used ALDC. Why is there a little bit of diacetyl in here? And it's not totally foolproof. And they say that's actually one of the advantages of those genetically modified yeast strains, like those that Omega makes. Unfortunately, they don't sell to the homebrew market anymore. Is that you are guaranteed to not have any diacetyl when you're using these modified yeast strains that prevent the formation of diacetyl. Whereas with ALDC, there is a tiny chance some diacetyl can squeak through, which might actually be a function of just not the right pH when adding it.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, so we're going to discuss the experiment that you did in the next segment, but you did focus on Festbier for that experiment. And I think it's a really good choice for various reasons. Now, just real quickly, the BJCP describes Festbier as a smooth, clean, pale German lager with a moderately strong malty flavor and a light hop character, deftly balances strength and drinkability with a palate impression and finish that encourages drinking, showcases elegant German malt flavors without becoming too heavy or feeling. To me, the keywords there when it comes to the potential for diacetyl, one, it's a lager. So you're using a lager strain that's known for, they're known for producing some level of diacetyl. You're going to cold ferment it traditionally. That is associated with higher diacetyl levels. It's higher OG, again, associated with yeast stress, which can produce diacetyl. So I feel like this was a really good style for this experiment.
Wow. I'm really patting myself on the back here. I didn't even think about the OG component as well. You're right. It really is kind of the perfect storm for diacetyl production. And as we'll talk about in the next section, I did all the traditional things which would increase the risk of diacetyl production.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, of the beers that I've had commercially where I'm almost certain I've detected diacetyl, Festbier is one that that is on the list, and it's one that I feel like a lot of people maybe rush to market, and that's why I'm going to Crow and Wolf later today for their Oktoberfest celebration. They're going to have a Festbier on, of course, and it is always so clean. But like you, Jordan, it's brewed well enough ahead of time so that they can take care to make sure that there are no off flavors in that beer. I feel like some breweries are like, 2 weeks before their Oktoberfest party are throwing together a batch of Fest beer, and that can really cause issues. So now it's certainly not my point to brag, but I can't think of a single beer that I've personally made that had high enough levels of diacetyl that it made it undrinkable. This may be, like you said, Jordan, a function of my sensitivity or lack thereof to this buttery compound, or perhaps my process is just adequate enough. Either way, I do think it's great that brewers have an option like ALDC, which you recently put to the test in an experiment. Those results when we're back from this break.
Brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
This week, on a very special episode of Health Discovered, we're taking a closer look at a condition that affects hundreds of thousands of men each year, prostate cancer.
I first found out about my cancer on my birthday at the age of 45. Found out my cancer had spread to my pelvic bone. And from there, life just changed.
About 1 in 8 men will be diagnosed with prostate cancer during their lifetime, and the risk increases with age.
Anything with cancer, you just think death sentence. And the only thing I could think about was, who's going to take care of my family? You have to go out there and build your support system. You got to build your team.
In this episode, we'll explore the science behind detection, along with the practical steps men can take to protect their health. Listen to Health Discovered on America's #1 podcast network, iHeart. Open your free iHeart app, search Health Discovered, and start listening.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle, as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. I don't hate butter. Actually, I quite like it, just not in my beer. While some of us employ a smattering of methods to reduce the chances of diacetyl off flavors showing up in our beer, ALDC offers brewers an arguably simpler option. You recently put it to the test in a Festbier, Jordan. Why don't you tell us about that?
I don't know about you, but I love Festbier. It's something about a seasonal beer that's actually good. You know, this ain't no pumpkin beer. And you get it, and fresh hop season, the Pacific Northwest kind of overlaps with it. So, we're kind of at the tail end of Oktoberfest beers and fresh hop season here. And I've just really been enjoying these seasonal beers. And Festbier is probably my favorite of those seasonal fall beers. And it's really simple. When you look at the German recipes, it's Pilsner malt with a little bit of Munich malt to hit that about 5 SRM. And so what I did was I brewed 2 dual 5-gallon batches of Festbier in my 240 volt Clawhammer supply units. And I add a little bit of Carahel in my recipe. So I'm adding using 84% Pilsner malt, 9% Munich malt, and 7% Carahel. This was last year's Festbier, so those were probably all Weyermann products. I like to use the German maltsters when making authentic German beers. And we need to do an experiment on this, Marshall. I'm not sure if we've looked at Carahel, but in theory, I'm getting a little bit of that kind of like rounded sweetness that we might associate with some of that German X Factor, maybe from some decoction brewing. And, I did do a step mash, but I think that a little bit of Carahel really helps round out some of these richer lager styles without making them overly sweet and still maintaining that crushability.
Yeah, I've never used Carahel. I kind of wrote off all Cara malts many years ago. I never liked Cara Munich. I never liked Cara Vienne. I stopped using Cara pills when I learned that it's actually foam negative and people were using it for foam, foam retention. So I've never used Carahel, but if I'm putting those two words together, Cara and Hell, it's a crystal malt, that light crystal malt, right? That sort of like Cara pills, or?
No, it's higher SRM. It's like 9 SRM, and I think Carapil's is like 2. So it is a very light crystal malt, like a Crystal 10, but from Germany. Okay.
I mean, I probably enjoy that more than I did Cara Munich. I thought that was one of the nastiest tasting malts that I've had. But anyways, carry on.
Yeah, Cara Munich, that stuff is really potent, and I would say there's only a couple styles that it's appropriate in, and this is not one of them, and you want to stick to like just a couple percent, because a beer can really go off the rails with Cara Munich.
Oh, yeah.
So, step mash for this beer, as I like to do. So I did 144F or 62C, then up to the Alpha Rest at 160F or 71C, and then finishing with a mash out at 170F or 77C. So once those mashes were complete, we removed those grains and proceeded to a boil for 75 minutes. As I'm raising it to a boil, I added 43 grams of Saphir at first wort hopping. And then we got our more standard bitterness charge at 60 minutes of 35 grams of Hallertau Mittelfrüh at 60. And finally, 43 grams of Hallertau Mittelfrüh at 3 minutes, just to give us a little bit of hop aroma. Even though these things are going to lager for a while, just that little bit of hop aroma at the end, I think it's kind of nice.
Yeah, Hallertau Mittelfrüh is such a good hop. It's one of the classic 4 noble hops. But Saphir, I at first wort hop, you're probably not getting much of the characteristics of that. If you're a fan of Pivo Pils from Firestone Walker, which I most definitely am, I believe that is one of the featured hops in that beer. So this just sounds like a great hopping regimen for a fest beer.
Yeah, they say, and I know we've tested it, that first wort hops is almost like the equivalent of a 20-minute addition, that somehow you're maintaining these aromas. I haven't tested it personally, so maybe it's not adding anything, but it's a really beautiful hop, and it's got this like nice modern noble-esque variety. Highly recommend people play around with it.
Yeah, I fully agree. And here's the thing. They also say first wort hopping will lend a, side by side, if you were to add a 60-minute addition versus a first wort hop, that the first wort hop one will have a smoother bitterness. Again, we haven't been able to prove that in a several first wort hopping experiments, but do what you want to do. To me, I first wort hop all the time because it's just easier.
It's super easy. So once these boils are finished, I had the same OG on the refract readings. Gotta love that. 1054. That's pretty good for the style. And then I chilled these worts down to 47F or 8C. And then each received 2 pouches of Imperial Yeast L13 Global. And, not probably the most diacetyl producing strain out there, but there are plenty of lagers in this world that used a global or a 3470 variant and had diacetyl in the glass that was served. So definitely, I think, an appropriate yeast choice for the style and also for the experiment.
Oh, I've absolutely had beers made by friends of mine that were fermented with the Weihenstephaner lager strain, which is global, as well as 3470 or WLP. I believe it's 830. Their German lager strain. It is the most popular lager strain in the world. So yes, I think it's a good choice because it can absolutely produce diacetyl.
But maybe not if we use ALDC, which is exactly the variable that we tested here. And so we added 1 dropper, which I think is about a 1/4 teaspoon, to one of the batches. The way that these Cellar Science ones work, which I think are really the popular option for homebrewers. God bless Cellar Science for bringing this product to us, because pros have been using it for years, but we only have had access to it for a few years now. It's this tiny little vial, and it has the cap has a dropper built into it, so it's super easy. Just at yeast pitch, you drop in, and you're off to the races.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing. I always hated, when a new product would come out, whether it's in brewing or not. And you're like, God, that sounds awesome. And then you read the instructions and you're like, God, this is going to add so much work. You keep doing what I'm doing if I'm not having issues. This is seriously easy. You add a dropper of it to your beer and then let it ferment. It couldn't be much easier.
And it's so easy and it's so affordable that it's in my SOP at this point. I add it to every single beer I make. Maybe not a Saison because I'm not worried about it there. But even if I'm worm fermenting a lager, might as well. Global 3470 is actually really good at not creating any detectable diacetyl, or at least in the finished product, if you ferment it warm, and you can still make a really clean beer like we've exposed. But it's great insurance. Why not? Especially with dry hopped beers. And as you know, Global is my house ale strain too. And so it's so cheap. It's so easy. Why not?
Your house strain for ales, we should say. It is a Pastorianus strain. It is a traditional lager strain. But you're not alone, Jordan. I'm telling you, I hear from a lot of people after they heard you comment on that, the fact that you're using Global for your IPA and your West Coast, all of this stuff. Other people started emailing me and saying, yo, I tried it and it works so good. And I'm with you. I mean, I've had a lot of your beers, ales, lagers fermented with that strain. Phenomenal.
It just works. So for this batch, getting back to the lager, we fermented it for 2 weeks cold. And I will say that I often do a diacetyl rest just for yet another piece of insurance. But on this one, to really test ALDC, we did not. So, we pitched right, but we fermented really cold, and only one of them received ALDC, and we did not do a diacetyl rest. So I actually spunded these at the tail end of fermentation, which can also reduce attenuation and make a more stressed fermentation at the end. So, I don't know that we talked about this, but I think that I wouldn't be surprised if spunding can actually be one more risk factor in terms of diacetyl production, given it's, slowing down and literally putting pressure on the fermentation. And so during that spunding phase, I'm then gradually reducing these beers down to 32F or 0 Celsius. And so ultimately, we really are able to test, is ALDC going to work?
Yeah, I'm with you on the spunding thing. You are, by putting pressure on the fermenter, you are also putting stress on those yeasts. They have to, and I don't know what it is about fermenting under pressure in general. I've talked about this a million times, that people seem to think magically somehow allows you to ferment warmer, whatever. Maybe it's just a home brewing thing. I don't know. But spunding, it would make sense to me that by throwing a spunding valve on a fermenting, a lager that's fermenting would also, at least on some small level, contribute to the higher risk of getting diacetyl in that beer.
Right. So let's see how it did. So we've got a FG of 1011, which is really good for this style, kind of right on the money. And so we, because you want a Festbier, it's kind of strong, right? And so you don't want a high finishing gravity in theory. I know we've tested that a lot too, because you don't want this to be sweet. You want this to be strong-ish yet crushable. 1011, perfect. And so at that point, we pressure transferred these beers to CO2 purge serving kegs, placed it on gas in the keezer for that kind of slow carbonation, and let it lager for a whole 8 weeks before they were ready for evaluation.
Yes. So everything here kind of lining up with the style. It's what you would expect. I love that you skipped the diacetyl rest, which I know is a part of your normal process, to really, try to amplify whether or not try to get diacetyl in one of the batches to see if ALDC works. But so far it sounds good. Now I'm looking at the pictures of these beers on the website right now, and they look identical to me. I know that the way you poured it makes it look like they don't have a real thick cap of foam, but that is clearly a stark white foam that is sticking around. Nice, clear. I would call it just a gold colored beer. Very, very clear. Everything about this, 8 weeks in the keg, it's going to be clear. But everything about it looks just like Festbier, both of them. There's no difference from observation, at least.
Yeah, and for those that want to, try their own Festbier, this is a great recipe. I made a similar variation this year. It's done well in competition. It got bronze in the category this year at our state lager competition. It's probably won gold before. Great recipe as long as you can get the process right. It's a fantastic recipe for the style.
Yeah, and when Jordan tells you that a recipe is good, just take his word. Those of us who have had his lagers know why we're saying that. All right, so one of the things that we do before presenting the beers to blind tasters is we perform a set of semi-blind triangle tests ourselves, usually 5, and we report our personal experiences with this beer. Out of the 5 triangle tests that you attempted, Jordan, how well did you do?
I only got 1. They tasted identical to me. Notably, I did not detect any diacetyl in either sample.
Yeah, that's a good thing because if you did, that would mean the ALDC didn't work and you got diacetyl in both beers. But in this case, what we could say is that whether or not the ALDC worked, it seems like your process still didn't produce enough diacetyl to be above that perceptible threshold for you, at least. Now, this is part of the reason we don't stop there and we serve these beer to blind tasters is because we fully recognize that other people might be more sensitive to certain things than we are. So in this case, you served the beer 20 different triangle tests to 20 different participants, out of which 11 would have needed to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some level of confidence that, yeah, it really does seem like the ALDC had a meaningful impact. In this case, out of those 20, how many got it right?
Only 9, which is not quite half of the sample. That is not a significant difference. So tasters could not reliably tell these beers apart in our sample.
Which again, when you add that to your personal experience, it really does seem to indicate that there likely just wasn't diacetyl in either of these beers, at least enough to taste. Which, from the perspective of, what are the implications of these results, seems to me to suggest that it's not that ALDC didn't work. It's that your process and the ingredients that you used in the way that you used them. And I'm looking at you, yeast, because you pitch, you'd pitch 2 pouches of yeast into each of these. You really did do what a normal brewer would do to make a good fest beer. It really does seem that mitigated or at least reduced the risk of developing diacetyl in the first place. So to my mind, while it didn't have much of an impact on these beers, it's still a good prophylactic. If you're making beers like this regularly, it's so cheap. There's really no reason not to include it as a just in case factor.
Absolutely. And, it's kind of funny. It wasn't really the purpose of the experiment, but it kind of exposes that it is possible to make a diacetyl-free beer using cold fermented lager without a diacetyl rest. As long as your yeast is right, apparently you don't actually need the diacetyl rest like the ALDC. It's just another piece of insurance. But I will say I'm bottling these beers using like a Blickman beer gun. I just find that it's easier for me to like bottle a bunch and then like label the caps. So then it's like, I'm going to go see some friends. I'll grab 3 experiment bottles and like some cups and like run the experiment on them as soon as I see them before they start, eating food or wrecking their palate. And, the Blickman beer gun has a CO2 purge function. And so maybe if I had done a really crappy job bottling them, maybe the ALDC free batch would have shown some diacetyl as the oxidation and the secondary packaging could have kicked off some diacetyl. So also maybe it speaks to just the quality of packaging that I was doing with the Blickman beer gun.
Yeah, I had the same exact thought that if that beer had set out for a little while, I think it's not an immediate reaction like, oh, diacetyl's there because you poured it out of the tap and oxygen was I think it takes a minute, but I do wonder that as well. Like what would have happened had that beer been exposed to oxygen before packaging? And that's something we could consider, for a future experiment testing out because again, we're silly like that and we're willing to waste beer or potentially waste beer. But either way, like I said, I've never had much of an issue that I'm aware of with diacetyl. I'll still probably pick up some ALDC because by my calculations for a 5-gallon batch, we're talking under $1 for the ALDC that you're adding. It's just one dropper. That's not a bad deal for insurance in my book. Now, we do have some reader comments to get to. The first one comes from Bobby. I hope I say this correctly. Mirzuski, who says, I've experimented with Omega Yeast's DKO yeast that creates ALDC with split batching and found the one thing ALDC doesn't do is prevent acetaldehyde problems. The diacetyl rest also hedges against that, so I will not be skipping it in the future with or without ALDC. What do you think?
I mean, that's a good point. It resolves one particular off flavor, not the rest of them. So you still have to mind your P's and Q's about sanitation, et cetera, to, avoid any of the other ones we're trying to avoid.
Yeah. And on the surface, ALDC has nothing to do with acetaldehyde. What Bobby is saying here is that the diacetyl rest that he does help to reduce any present acetaldehyde. And so he's going to do the D-rest anyways. He's not saying that ALDC, also affects acetaldehyde. That's not the point, but I get where he's coming from, and I'm kind of in the same boat. I think you are too. Even with ALDC, you're still typically doing D-rest, right?
Yes, yeah, and following all the other best practices, pitching enough yeast, I oxygenate, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to think of it, is that the compilation of best practices is your best bet against getting these off flavors in beer. So I'm with you there, Bobby. Next comment comes from our friend Will Allwart, who said, I'll be interested to see how this product works on a highly dry hopped beer, which I'm sure is already on the brew schedule for you, Jordan.
Yeah, I don't know that we've tested that. That's a great idea because I do use it as regular practice, and I actually recently had a hoppy beer that I rushed, and I got diacetyl, and I think I forgot to add ALDC at dry hop. I was pissed, dude. It was
I bet
like an average non-brewer friend is like, "What are you talking about? This is great," but I was like, me and my brewer friends, we hated it. So definitely like using ALDC for the hoppy beers, and I think that's a great experiment idea.
I just want a little aside here. Your humility and being able to admit you're one of the best brewers I know, Jordan. I'm not trying to make, pat your back or anything. You truly are. You won Oshbodie. You're a good brewer, and yet we still screw up at times. All of us make bad batches occasionally. It's okay to talk about it. We don't have to try to think that we're better than everybody else. I love that you admit that. And I can only imagine your frustration thinking, how the hell did I forget to put ALDC in this when you knew that it could potentially, reduce that perceptible diacetyl? Oh, I'd be frustrated too. Okay, this final comment, I'm gonna put a little disclaimer on it. I'm gonna go into some statistics here. If that bores you, I'm gonna try to keep it as simple as possible. But Dwayne says that 45% of the taste testers were able to reliably pick the odd beer. That is a significant number. Most people have a very low threshold for detecting this off flavor. All right, Dwayne. So this is for you and anybody. We've gotten this comment many times. I mean, no offense by going into this, but just to provide some further explanation as to how this statistic actually works. I know that they're confusing, so I did my best to kind of dumb it down to the way that would make sense to me. So in a triangle test, there are 3 samples, meaning that if all of those beers are identical, each sample would be expected to be picked by tasters 33% of the time. So 33% of tasters, if you had 33 tasters, 11 each would be expected to pick one of those cups if the beers are identical. So 33% of 20 is about 7 tasters, meaning only 2 additional tasters happened to guess the unique sample in this experiment. That's how randomness works, though. It's rarely ever perfectly even, as was the case in this particular experiment. Now, a significant p-value, we opt for the 0.05 standard. Feel free to use the 0.01 if you want when you're reading our experiments. It doesn't bother us. But this significant p-value occurs when a certain amount more tasters than would be expected identify the unique sample. So in this case, out of those 20, we needed 11. If just 13 happened to pick it, or I'm sorry, if 9 happened to pick it, just because it's 2 under 11 doesn't allow us to say, well, it was almost significant. No, that is so close to random anyways. That's why that statistics and p-values and such were created, was to give us some threshold for saying, oh yeah, you know what, it really does look like there's a meaningful difference here. So to put it simply, this doesn't prove, when we have a significant or a non-significant finding, it doesn't prove much. It just gives us some indications, right? So it doesn't prove that the beers are different or not different, but rather suggests tasters' inability to distinguish the beers was likely a function of random guessing, and at least somewhat more likely to due to there being a perceptible difference between the beers if it's significant. So, given the effort we put in brewing these beers as similarly as possible, we like to think that we can extrapolate on some level that the differences were most likely caused by whatever variable it is we're testing. Again, a non-significant finding, as was the case in this experiment, does not mean that the variable has no impact. We cannot say that. It just means that tasters couldn't reliably distinguish these beers despite there being something done differently between them. That is all we're saying. The last thing we want is for people to take these fun homebrewing experiments, which, yes, we do take them seriously. We do everything we can to isolate the variables, and to turn them into some form of like fact that, oh, look, you if you add ALDC, it doesn't do anything, and so you don't need to use it. That is by no means what we're saying. So I'm going to leave it at that. Dwayne, I appreciate you saying that because it gave me the opportunity yet again to stand on my soapbox and talk about nerdy stats. So that is all the time we've got for this episode. Jordan, do you have any last words before we wrap this one up?
Can't recommend ALDC enough. It's an amazing cheat code in the Brewer's Toolkit. Use it. Make less diacetyl bomb beer.
Yeah, I'm so close to finally having the opportunity to build out my brewery at home. And one of the things I'm going to buy is ALDC just because, like I said before, it's cheap insurance. And the last thing I want is a buttery beer. So don't forget to check out the killer content Martin is creating over at The Brülosophy Show, which you can subscribe to at youtube.com/@TheBrülosophy. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brülosophy Show with no umlaut. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on Brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit Patreon.com/Brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.